When we were learning basic JavaScript, we looked at using Firebug or Chrome for interactive practice and testing, and we saw how valuable that was, how useful it was for learning. When learning jQuery, the same thing applies, perhaps even more strongly. So I want to review that process and tweak it a little for use with jQuery. So if you're using Firefox with Firebug, you first make an HTML page, just as we did before. But there are two differences now. One, that HTML page should have some things in it. Put in some headings, put in a div, put in some nested elements, put in some elements that have an ID maybe, or a CSS class name, and so forth. The second thing is that HTML page should load jQuery, just the core jQuery.js library. So now when you bring up that HTML page in Firefox and then you launch Firebug, you can call now not just standard JavaScript calls, you can also make jQuery calls. Not only can you make jQuery calls, but those jQuery calls are in the context of the page that was up when you launched Firebug. And since that page has a few random HTML elements in it, and since one of the most common things you do with jQuery is to find and perhaps modify HTML elements, you have some elements that you can practice with. Because you're modifying the HTML page, it's probably better to have Firebug attached to the main window so that you can see the Firebug console and see your browser at the same time. And so the console tab is the same as before, but now the console tab will kind of be at the bottom of the page so you can see the HTML and you can see the JavaScript at the same time. Whereas when you were learning core JavaScript, the HTML didn't really matter, and so you tended to pop up the console in Firebug that was in a separate window. And doing it in Chrome is almost the same. You go to the Chrome menu, Tools, Developer Tools, and you have the same sort of idea where jQuery is already loaded. It's in the context of the current page. You can try things interactively. And in Chrome, just like in Firebug, you can have the console integrated into the main page. All right, so that's the basic idea. And here's a sample HTML file that might do it. So perhaps I'll have a style sheet with a few simple styles in it that change the background color or something like that. But for sure, I've got to load jQuery, typically from a subfolder, and typically you've renamed the actual file you downloaded to a more generic name as we discussed. But then put some things in the page. Put in some headings, maybe some divs, maybe use some style sheet names from your CSS file so that you have something to practice your jQuery calls on. All right, so that's the basic idea. Let's try it out. Okay, so I bring up the page that I just showed in Firefox with Firebug attached. I launch Firebug. Firebug, in this case, because I had configured it that way earlier, comes up in a separate window. So I click on this little tab up here in the right corner, and when I press it, now Firebug is down at the bottom of the main window, so I can see the HTML and I can see Firebug at the same time, and I might want to make it a little bit smaller so that I can see more of the HTML page. And now let me try a few things. We'll discuss what all of these things mean in the next little section, but just as a preview, let's try it out. So if I go into the console and JavaScript is already there and jQuery has been loaded, and if I just type in a non-existent function name like blah, I get a message from JavaScript that says blah is not defined very naturally. But if I type in $, $sign is not a built-in function in raw JavaScript. But if this HTML page has properly loaded jQuery, when I try to evaluate that, it will say, oh yes, that's a function. The function is actually named $. So the first test you should do is just type in the $sign variable, run it, and see if it's defined or not. If it's not defined, you goofed in how you loaded jQuery. If it's defined, then you can go ahead and try things. So one of the things that you can try is in parentheses, remember $sign is a function, a weird function name, but it's a function, you can put a string. And that string is a CSS selector pattern, just as we talked about in the lecture on CSS. We'll give a lot more details about this shortly, but my page had some h1 elements in it. So if I say $sign and then h1 in a string, jQuery will search for that CSS pattern in the page that was up when you launched Firebug, and it will return an array of all the elements that match. And so it found 3 of them. So my page had 3 h1 elements. But if I search for, say, form, this particular HTML page that I'm on right now does not have a form element. And so jQuery returns an empty array. It didn't find any. All right, and I can try a number of operations on the things that match. So if I go back to h1, we'll see very shortly that hide with an option, if you want to, with an option slow, means make the matching elements disappear. So if I run this, whoop, all the h1 elements disappear. And if I say show, they reappear. And then I can do some practice. For example, the title at the top is an h1, but it's not inside a div. Whereas the 2 next h1 headings are inside of a div. How can I differentiate? Well, if you remember from the section on CSS, space in a CSS selector string means nesting. Okay, so I can say div h1. In other words, find h1s, but only if they're inside a div. And let's try first to see if they exist. Oh yeah, I'd only found 2 this time. And so I'll say, all right, now I want to hide them slowly. And I want to show them again. And I have other things in the page as well. So if I scroll down, I'll see that I have some lists. And I have some nested lists. So I could say, well, let me find all li elements in the page. Oh, it found a bunch of them. But now you might want to say, I only want to find the ones that are part of nested lists. How can I differentiate? Well, I can differentiate by looking at nesting with spaces. So I can say, look for an li that's inside another li. And now it only finds 4. It finds these 4, but it doesn't find the 2 at the top. And if I wanted to, I could practice hiding them. Hide slow, whoop, and so forth. So the point is, load an HTML page for interactive testing in Firebug, just like we did with raw JavaScript. But this time, do 2 things. 1, put some interesting HTML elements in that page. 2, make sure you have a script tag that loads raw jQuery. Bring up Firebug. If it's not already integrated into the HTML page, click the little button at the top right that makes it integrated into the HTML page. Make sure the $sign variable is defined. If it's not defined, you failed in loading jQuery. And then try some simple things, in particular, looking for HTML elements via CSS patterns, hiding them, making them appear again. We'll give a lot more details on all of those things later, but start off with some simple testing. And even then later, when you try advanced things, do it interactively before you do it from a file.